This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? This is such good shit. Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I'm a little behind schedule this morning, so I want to try to get rolling with things. Hope everyone's doing well on this scorching heat wave that's hit the Northeast. I don't remember it being this hot in PA for well over 15 years. It's not even pleasant to be outside. I was out in the sun the other day for like 45 minutes. That's all I could take. Got a sick tan out of it, though. But we're inside now. Got the fans going. You could probably hear it in the background if you listen carefully enough. Just sounds like white noise. The AC's cranked down to a good solid 67 degrees. That's when you know it's bad. When I have to bring the temperature down below 69 just to be comfortable. And I hate being cold. So it's Friday. Another Friday in the books. And we got some classic wrestling to dive into. As always, make sure you guys subscribe and comment if you are new to the show. Give it a like as well if you don't mind. And make sure you come back and check us out on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for new content and new podcasts. Got a lot of fun stuff we cover here on the channel, and especially if you're a fan of classic wrestling, you will like the topics we cover. Just like NWA World Championship Wrestling. The glory years are over, but we're still kicking through. I actually kind of like the way they opened the studio show this week. They were airing separate tape footages of Lex Luger and Ric Flair working local squash matches. And while we see them working their own individual opponents, Tony Schiavone's doing the dubbed over commentary to try to hard sell the Baltimore match for July 10th. And I don't think we've really seen them shoot or produce anything like this. Normally with the cold opens, they'll show you like 60 seconds of a random angle or a match from some live event or maybe one of the syndicated programs. But you normally don't hear commentary over it. So in a way, it was kind of like a dry run of a promo package, just without the overproduction. It certainly was not a WWE-style video package, but I liked it. It was cool. And that also explained why Tony wasn't at the studio this week. JR and David Crockett were riding solo, so it was a two-man commentary booth this go-around, which I'm sure David was elated for. He's like, they aren't phasing me out of the color roll just yet, brother. I'm hanging on with every fiber of my being. Milking that paycheck for all it's worth. I did have to point out here, speaking of David's commentary, while they're running down the card for the show, there's a random point where JR mentions that Paul Jones will have a big surprise for later on. And I don't know why I found this so funny, but David just goes, "That's right, JR. And we're not going to tell you about Paul Jones right now. You have to see him to believe it." I was like, the fuck is this guy talking about? Was that basically David saying, it's always Trainwreck TV when Paul Jones comes out to talk? So what you are about to see later on is not scripted? He's really that god-awful at promos? Well, in that case, I believe him. Which is like just his delivery on the whole thing. You have to see him to believe it. Like he's a magician. So our first match, we're already breaking out the comedy lesson 5 minutes in this week. A match that I am not making up. The Fantastics versus Kurt Thompson and Agent Steel. Agent Steel. First name Agent, last name Steel. You can't make this shit up, people. You really can't. I never listened to Agent Steel growing up. I know they were a very popular metal band based out of LA. I think you would call their genre speed metal, which is basically a modified term for heavier power metal. It was a big thing at one point. Still kind of is to this day. Although I think it's more in the vein of progressive metal than anything. But maybe this guy was a huge fan of Agent Steel. I can definitely confirm here, he was definitely not made of steel. He was every stereotypical outlaw mass job guy you've ever seen throughout the 80s. I just thought it was funny how nobody bothered to communicate what color ring trunks everyone was going to wear. So everybody came out wearing virtually the same shade of blue. But the story they're trying to get over is that the Fantastics are still playing mind games with Corny by bringing out the straitjacket, hyping up the big showdown for the Bash Tour. The Fantastics went over with the rocket launcher. In my head, it seemed like this match went on for an eternity. In actuality, it was probably like 5 minutes, which was still probably about 3 minutes too long, especially for these jabronis. And I don't care what kind of substances Kurt Thompson was taking at the time. Ain't no reason he should have been getting that much visual offense on Tommy Rogers and Bobby Fulton. Ridiculous. So then we followed that with a Kevin Sullivan interview. It was more like a Kevin Sullivan seminar class. This was finally the week where we got a little inside lecture on the background of the Tower of Doom. The structure that Kevin Sullivan built from scratch in order to get back at Jimmy Garvin for stealing his woman. I mean, shit, dude. If only men in today's society were this patient to seek revenge on guys that steal their chick. We'd be out digging trenches in the backyard right now trying to avoid cannon fodder. Nowadays, when men get screwed by their chick, they just say, nah, fuck it. She ain't worth the hassle anyway. So Sullivan is talking about ancient mythology and Princess Hunanumdrum and the Habuda Dean. Well, the fuck, of course. Everybody knows about the Habuda Dean. He's only been talked about in every history book ever written. I mean, they've been writing thesis papers on him for hundreds of years. So yes, I have no idea what the hell was happening here. The stipulations are, it's 5 men against 5 men. You have to finagle your way down a cage to escape, but only certain chamber pods or whatever open up at specific moments. Again, we're going to review that match when we talk about the 88 Bash Tour event in Baltimore. I promise you, all this anticipation for the actual match, everything they're doing to give you the idea that this is going to be some spectacle, it is not worth the wait. There's never been a single moment in history where a WCW fan said, hey, remember the Tower of Doom cage match? Remember how awesome that was? It wasn't. So up next, we had Nikita Koloff and Dr. Death versus Max MacGyver and Bob Riddle. This is the greatest moment in all of 1988. And it happened like 2 minutes into the match. Nikita's in there doing collar and elbow tie-ups with Riddle. And for whatever reason, this fucking idiot Bob Riddle, he decides, I'm going to give Nikita a little nudge in the back of the neck. Bad move. This did not go over well with Nikita. And you immediately see the expression change on Nikita's face. So he locks up with Bob Riddle, and he just starts unloading. Like, this is the Nikita Koloff of 1986 intensity. The Russian nightmare that we all came to know and love. If only he shaved his head. It would have been like going back in a time machine. Just watching Nikita beat the crap out of Bob Riddle for being an unprofessional dick. That was the best thing on the entire show this week. And you could tell, too, Riddle was doing everything to try to get away from this guy. And eventually he tagged in MacGyver, and it just kind of turned into a series of power moves until Dr. Death won with the Oklahoma Stampede. And then we went back to the booth for a Lex Luger promo. He's doing more Bash Tour hype for the title match with him and Flair. He's using like every cliche metaphor known to man. The cream will rise to the top. When the going gets tough, the juices are flowing. All these phrases you could basically print on a t-shirt. This is one of those, Luger, go out there and talk about Ric Flair for 3 minutes. And Luger had nothing pre-planned. So he just went out there and shot from the hip. Thought up every allegory derived by the human species. He basically promised he would win the belt from Flair in Baltimore. I did laugh here. When he was reflecting back on the Miami beatdown in the parking lot, he actually said this statement. That moment is forever emblazoned in my mind. That may be the only time in recorded history where the word emblazoned was ever used on a wrestling program. Luger breaking out those $1 million words. I mean, he went to college after all. And then after that, we came back for a very strange pre-tape segment with Steve Chamberlain, the vice president of Turner Home Entertainment at the time. I mean, this is actually where they made the announcement that the Great American Bash in Baltimore is only available via pay-per-view. So everybody needed to make sure they called their local listings to make sure they had the ability to even order the event in their designated area. I mean, wrestling pay-per-view has certainly come a long way since the 80s. I mean, God, pay-per-view is such a foreign concept for so many people anymore just because of all the streaming platforms. Do we even call it pay-per-view anymore? I mean, WWE's been calling it premium live specials for how many years now? It is emblazoned in our minds. See what I did there? It is kind of amazing to look back at this period to hear all these outdated terms. Like he actually said here to tune into your local radio listings. Who the fuck listens to radio in 2024? So then we pitch back to the ring to watch the Road Warriors obliterate two job guys. It was the sloppiest, most glorious ass beating I've ever seen. Actually, the entire match, I'll just read you the following list of spots. Animal nearly losing the one guy in a press slam position. But of course, he still caught him because he's Animal and he's a fucking powerhouse. The job guy then not cooperating on an Irish whip spot. So Animal shot him off as hard as he possibly could, and the guy nearly fell on his face. And then Hawk killed him with a top rope lariat. Now you see, this is the one thing that's been missing from the studio shows in the last 2 months. hideous, ugly Road Warrior squashes where they just recklessly kill job guys with 2 left feet. They're the best. And then they did the greatest promo of all time. A shoot-style promo, to adopt a wrestling term here. And, well, I guess I should provide some context here and lay out the timeline. I mean, I've talked about it plenty, but just in case there are any new viewers watching. So for practically the last 6 or so months, the Road Warriors have been feuding with the Powers of Pain. They had shot the bench press angle where the Barbarian and the Warlord laid out Hawk and Animal. They did the whole injury thing with Animal's eye. The Road Warriors were off selling the attack for a while. And over the last month or two, they've been slowly building to these series of scaffold matches that were pre-planned for the 88 Bash Tour all across the country. But then Warlord and Barbarian got cold feet when they realized not only were they going to have to work a bunch of scaffold matches for 2 months straight, but that they were also scheduled to lose all of them. And so they pulled the Hulk Hogan card. That doesn't work for me, brother. And they both left the company, high and dry. So we essentially had a segment here where Hawk and Animal called out the Powers of Pain for being a bunch of pussies. They said that when it came time to put up or shut up, the POP took their ball and went home like a bunch of cowards. And now they're abruptly turning their attention in another direction. So Hawk and Animal will now be feuding with Ivan Koloff and his Russian assassin, so to speak. But, yeah, they very quickly threw Warlord and Barbarian under the bus here. They did not let that story go quietly. Dusty probably said, "Rip into 'em, boys. Let them know what a bunch of no-good pussies they are. Leaving us high and dry when the time is right." And so they did. I mean, they tried to kayfabe it as best they could, but you could tell they were legitimately fired up here. And who could blame them? All that fucking business they did where the Road Warriors essentially sacrificed their mystique as monster killers. Because remember, they had to look vulnerable in order to let the Powers of Pain get some heat on them. And no other tag team throughout NWA history has ever done that. Literally, so when we got to the payoff, the moment of truth, now the other party doesn't want to return the favor. So yeah, it was kind of a bullshit move. And I like the Barbarian, but it was not professional. I mean, they made it this far in the storyline, and right at the point the payoff was forthcoming, the heels pulled out and said, "Nah, we're good. We don't want to put you guys over." Wrestling politics, folks. You could write a book on it. Al Perez versus Dark Star. Boring match. Perez did 100 moves and won with a spinning toe hold. That's all I care to say about it. Then we get our first look at Paul Jones's big top secret surprise. The Powers of Pain are out. So now we have to resort to Plan B. Him and Ivan Koloff alike. They have brought in the Russian assassin to take care of business at the Bash Tour. And he took out the Italian Stallion this week. I believe the man under the mask was David Sheldon. And I know that name might not sound too familiar for a lot of people. You and me both alike. I mean, he was really only around the business for maybe a couple of years by this point. I think he started off in Calgary before he went to Mid-Atlantic a little bit later on. I don't really have a lot of extensive knowledge about his Crockett run in particular, but I know it wasn't very extensive. I mean, he only wrestled for maybe about another 9 or 10 years before his retirement. I think he had a real serious injury that kind of forced him into retirement in the mid-90s. But yeah, he wasn't around for too long. I know 10 years might seem like an eternity to a lot of people, but in wrestling years, it's really not that much. And this was clearly a last-minute backup plan, bringing him in here to team with Ivan. They needed to put some kind of finality to the Road Warriors-Paul Jones feud. So I think he's around mainly through the Bash Tour. He might stick around to work a couple more matches afterwards, but I think he pretty much leaves the area right after this. And I think he goes to Dallas for a while, and fuck if I didn't remember what happens afterwards. Again, it was just a showcase squash to let the fans know who he is. The hired Russian gun of Paul Jones. But they shot a quick angle here to let the heels try to wrap a chain around Stallion's neck. Then they sent out a handful of underneath guys to feed for Ivan and the Assassin here. You know, trying to put him over as strong as they can, since they really are on a crunch time before all the Bash Tour stuff kicks off. You know, they need to give these guys some form of credibility. And for the record here, again, I know they're desperate. They're trying to course correct for the abrupt departure of the Powers of Pain. With that said, trying to convince a TV audience that the Russian Assassin was 6'8" and 350 pounds. What planet do they think we live on? At most, he was probably 6'4" and 270. I know we wrestling fans are dumb, but we're not stupid. So then we came back to see some more footage of a good old-fashioned slobber knocker. An incident that took place in Savannah, Georgia. Now, Jim Ross was supposed to interview Dusty, but a brawl had broken out between him and Barry in the locker room. A mysterious brawl that apparently could not be captured on film, despite the camera guy and JR standing directly outside the door. The only thing we saw initially was Dusty stumbling out of the locker room with a bloody eye and what appeared to be him dumping an entire bottle of water on his dress shirt. He was like, I gotta make this look real. I got it. I'll liquidize my shirt, daddy. And I'll roll my sleeves up. That'll make it look legit. So, of course, out empties the babyface cavalry, flanking Dusty to the ring. And we eventually see Barry run down to tackle Dusty. And they basically have an impromptu street fight while all the heels and babyfaces are kind of working as lumberjacks outside the ring. And there was a funny moment they captured here. Totally unintentional, but it was so perfect. There's a spot where Al Perez is standing like 5 feet to the right of Sting. And obviously Perez is a heel. Sting is a babyface. Ideally, when you're mapping out how this segment should go, those guys should not be staying remotely anywhere close to each other. So Gary Hart, instinct kicking in, seeing that there's a fucking good guy and a bad guy standing less than 5 feet from each other, he grabs Perez by the arm and he basically hurls him to the other side of the ring. And of course, we're not supposed to see this on camera, but there's a camera guy that's like standing right behind them filming the whole thing. I mean, clearly Perez fucked up. But it was so funny. Like Sting pretending like Perez wasn't right next to him the whole time. Because peripherally, you could tell he's there. So he's probably thinking, maybe if I don't look, we could pretend like we don't see each other. So thank God for Gary Hart. The only guy in this segment with 2 brain cells to rub together. But that was all there was to the footage. Barry and Dusty brawling for a while. And Barry oversold everything because it's Dusty. He wanted the shit to look good. And this is the other big story they're pushing right now underneath the Flair Luger program, so gotta give it substance. And then we went back to the studio for something completely unrelated. A Ronnie Garvin squash match. I want you to pause the show right now. Without looking, do you remember the last time we saw Ron Garvin wrestle a singles match on this program? I can't recall. It has been ages. Like, no joke, I had to make sure I was watching the correct program. When I saw this match come up, I was like, did we go back to 1986 all of a sudden? I still have to remind myself that Ron Garvin is still around. Not for much longer, of course. He wrestled Jerry Price. Nobody in the room cared. It was every Ron Garvin squash you've seen in the last 3 years. David Crockett said, look at him about 5,000 goddamn times. I'm still not convinced we didn't time warp. This had to have been stock footage from 1986 that they just shoehorned into the middle of the program for no reason. They realized they didn't have enough pre-tape material, so they said, quick, throw a Ron Garvin match in there. No one will notice. And then we had an all-timer. Jim Ross interviewing Precious's bosoms. You know, I could probably end the conversation right there. Cold turkey. Precious's boobs. End of sentence. They were blaring on the television. Oh, God, this segment. Talk about pulling teeth on Jim's end. So, I mean, I will do my best to try to recap what happened here. JR is trying to get the inside scoop on the relationship between Precious and Kevin Sullivan. And like the whole time Precious is doing this interview, well, first of all, let me point this out. This is a solo Precious interview. No Jimmy Garvin. And it is long-winded. This was not a short promo. It was long. And you can tell she was incredibly uncomfortable. Legitimately, too. Not in a working manner. Like, you just watch her mannerisms here. She's constantly playing with her hair. She's like mumbling through shit. At one point, she actually started laughing, looking off to the side. I mean, this segment is dying a rancid death in front of our eyes. But JR is trying to be a pro. You know, asking if there's anything going on between her and Kevin Sullivan. And she keeps denying it. And eventually JR brings up that night in Tallahassee. At which point, Precious goes into one of her hysterical tirades, and she starts getting physical with JR by pounding him in the chest. And she's having a conniption in front of everybody. Eventually, the Garvins come out and take her to the back. And then JR's closing line, he just stands there and goes, well, clearly something happened in Tallahassee. And that's when I said, yep. And it didn't draw a fucking dime. This segment was so awkward, dude. I can't even begin to describe how bad it was. Again, the entire thing was far too long. It was the worst interview JR's ever conducted. He's getting all these lame-ass single-word answers out of Precious. Like, he keeps asking her things like, are you and Sullivan friends? And she would just nonchalantly go, no. And he keeps asking her things that are related to in that ballpark, like, are you and Sullivan friends? Were you ever friends? Were you ever romantically involved? And every single answer from Precious, just this robotic, stone cold, no. I'm like, the fuck are we doing here? Get the hook. Turn the red light off. End the segment. Jesus Christ, it was horrible. Just like, I mean, it's every problem I've had with the Varsity Club Garvin's feud from the beginning. The acting in this thing is beyond atrocious. The story is beyond preposterous. These random hysteria outbursts from Precious that are never explained. You know, aside from Sullivan put a magical spell on her. God, it's so bad. And this segment did not do the feud any favors. I have no idea how they didn't try to do a second take on this. If this was the final cut, I'd have taken the whole thing off the show. Just say, fuck it, we'll put a replacement segment in there. Ric Flair, go out and cut another promo. I mean, I know Precious was never a promo magician, but I remember her being a lot better than this. This is just awful, dude. Cable access level bad. And that is truly saying something. So that led us to Tully and Arn's match with Tommy Angel and Don Grundy. Another fucking epic job guy name. Don Grundy. With the douchebag ponytail and the back of the mullet to go along with the look. It was one of those matches where Tully and Arn just beat the ever-loving shit out of him the whole time. Didn't even let Angel tag in one time. And I was glad. I just wanted to see the Horsemen beat this idiot into powder. They dissected him forever. Both hit their finishers on him but refused to actually pin him. And that's when you know they're actively trying to murder a guy. When they hit their finish and they say, nah, let's beat him up some more. We got time. And eventually Arn won with the Gourd Buster. And then we had the actual best segment on the entire show. Without exaggeration this time. Ric Flair. He was all game mode this week. The classic nature boy that we all come to expect. He was riding high this week. He's talking about the Baltimore Showdown, saying that for 6 years, he's been the guy in this sport. He's been the man to beat. And while he's had his stumbling blocks along the way, and this is kind of true, by and large, he's been the unstoppable world champion. And we've now reached that moment in history where somebody comes along that the people think actually might be the man to beat Flair, to put him away for good. The one that can stop Flair's momentum. But the bottom line, in order for Luger to cement himself as the man, he's got to beat the most unstoppable force in wrestling throughout the 1980s. And Flair will see it through that does not happen. For Flair to continue his legacy, he has to beat Luger in Baltimore. He can't let the young prodigy get the better of him. Well, you'll be shocked to hear, Flair was proven right. Not to outright spoil the finish, but, I already kind of did. It all goes back to what I covered in that Luger promo the other week. The one that kind of put into perspective the reality of where we were in 1988. Their one opportunity to elevate a huge megastar and capitalize on all that momentum they've been building for the last year. And they Lugered him. They yanked the rug out from under him. And it's amazing. I'm sitting there listening to Flair the whole time. He's like, Luger, if you want to be the guy, you have to beat the guy. Well, Luger didn't beat the guy. So it kind of makes this segment come off like a popcorn fart. Great promo. But then you kind of realize that the heel was proven right. The babyface failed to triumph. And as a fan, you're like, well, fuck. That's a bust. Why should I cheer this man now? Well, stay posted. There's plenty more to come on Lex Luger's career. Then we had Kevin Sullivan versus Ryan Wagner. Sullivan beat him up and won with the clothesline in 60 seconds. That's not even me intentionally glossing over anything. That was the whole match. At which point, we then go back to the interview booth for a Horseman promo. And Arn's standing there with his slicked back hair, talking about what it takes to be a world champion. He says that no man ever won a world title by fighting solely through emotion. You need game plan, strategy, and intellect. Something Luger knows nothing about because he's constantly fighting from over his shoulder. And that'll be his ultimate downfall in Baltimore. And then Tully took a minute to plug the tag title match with Sting and Nikita. He said they need to worry about themselves and not the backup reinforcement they're probably banking on. I mean, it's all pretty standard stuff. More Bash Tour hype. It is kind of funny how we're still like a month out from that event. It already has the feel of a go-home show where they're just keep selling the shit out of the card. Keep bumping tickets and boosting sales. Ain't that a funny thing? When wrestling used to actually plug shit well in advance. It's almost like promoters had a clue at one point. They weren't booking for the sickos. Wink, wink. And that took us to the final series of segments this week, all focused around the Midnight Express. First of all, I have to point this out. Jim Cornette cutting a promo in a suit and a tie while still having the Great American Bash t-shirt as a pullover. He looked like such a tool bag. I loved it. In any case, blah blah, Midnights versus Fantastics, blah blah, Baltimore, blah blah, straitjacket, blah blah, Jim Cornette suspended above the ring in a 50-foot cage, blah blah, 9.7 million homes. Same stuff we've been hearing about. And then we had an amazing 8-man TV main event. And when I say amazing, it was a total sprint match. And while they definitely had some star power here, it was just the most random crop of talent you could possibly think of. Like all the leftovers that were still on the show this week, they just threw them all out at the end to have a match. It is a 8-man tag. The Midnights teaming with the Sheepherders, which was a sight to behold, against the babyface team of Jimmy Garvin, the Mighty fucking Wilbur, and the Lightning Express, Tim Horner and Brad Armstrong. It was such a random match. And they only gave him like 5 minutes. We actually didn't get a finish here because they ran out of time. But it was all action. I mean, I'm not going to bother breaking down everything move for move because, it was just constant in and out tags from everybody. There was no downtime. I mean, the stuff with the Midnights and the Lightning Express looked good because they were 4 incredible athletes. And then Wilbur and the Sheep Whackers get in there and bog the match down with their lumbering offense. Jim Garvin was kind of a non-entity here. There was a great moment here. Came up during JR's commentary where he's just trying to cut down Jim Cornette before the Bash Tour. He goes, Cornette got kicked off the checker team in high school. He was so unathletic. That got a fucking pop out of me. It was so offhanded. but it was so perfectly timed. The JRJC one-liners are truly something else. I wish we could have documented more back and forth banter between those two. They had such natural chemistry together. But yeah, non-finish to a main event. Kind of just a fun way to go out right as the babyfaces were getting their offense going. You know, the show definitely had peaks and valleys, as they all do. But again, man, the end goal is Baltimore. That's what they're promoting. And to be honest with you, I'm starting to see why business really picked up around the summertime. Because they are not backing down from getting the people to want to see these matches. I don't know anybody in their right mind who would have wanted to see the Tower of Doom cage match. But credit to them for getting it over with the people. Again, maybe for the spectacle of it, there's an intrigue there. It's surely not for the acting ability of Precious. But yeah, fun little show by and large. It was never going to save the company long term, but it kept the wheels going. And it's definitely masking all the financial problems happening behind the scenes that we still don't know about. But we'll switch gears to Midsouth programming for the week. And after last week's show, there was one question on everybody's mind as we went into this episode. Why, Butch, why? Everybody wants to know what's going on with Butch Reed. He came out last week, vented some frustrations about his treatment in the Midsouth area, basically threw shade at the Junkyard Dog by saying that he's standing in his way of becoming the top guy in Mid-South. And during their little scuffle, we also saw Reed and Ted DiBiase form an unexpected alliance during the 2-on-1 beatdown. So we have a lot of questions that need attended to. And that was sort of the overarching story for this week. But we pretty much delve right into the action, right from the top of the program. Mr. Wrestling 2 versus Denny Alberts. And this is something that kind of hit me during the week. Completely at random. Where the fuck has Wrestling 2 been lately? Seems like we haven't seen him on TV in weeks. You know, all the stuff that's been going on in the main event picture with the Rat Pack and JYD and Hacksaw Duggan. Now you throw Butch Reed into the equation. I forgot all about poor Wrestling 2. And there really wasn't any kind of explanation for his disappearance. They just called the match here like he'd been on the show every week for the last month and a half. And they actually worked an interesting little story here, even though it was a basic squash. Denny Alberts kept scouting the knee lift attempts from 2, kept dodging and getting out of the way early on, and 2 was sort of milking the eventual knee lift at the end, which he got on Alberts during a running charge in the corner. The other thing of note here, and I don't think I mentioned it the other week, just because the thought never even occurred to me. I mean, normally we don't spend too long fixating on the referees, but we did get our first look at Joel Watts the other week. He was the official for several of the underneath matches. And of course, we all know Joel Watts would eventually become a prominent color man for the announce team later on. Boy, howdy, what a colossal failure that was. You know, I'll say this. Bill Watts did a lot of great, intelligent things as a promoter during his time. Assigning Joel Watts to the commentary booth. Not one of those wiser decisions. But it's interesting here. He actually went by Joel Armstrong. And like, I mean, it was funny because Watts is putting him over the whole time. calling him a good-looking young man. If you were smart to the business, you could put two and two together. But that's something I really didn't even think about. Why he went by Joel Armstrong before he was recognized as Joel Watts. I mean, Brian Last would know. He's a Midsouth savant. In any case, good showcase for two. Short little match to put him over. Nothing much more to note about it. And then we had King Kong Bundy versus Tito Santana. A hard-fought battle by the Matador here. But we all know he never stood a chance. This is actually a really fun match. They worked the traditional David Goliath story where Tito doing everything he could to avoid Bundy and wait for him to make a critical error. That way he could capitalize since he knows he's not going to outpower Bundy. So early on, it's all mostly Bundy in control. Tito's kind of buying his time. And as Bundy's trying to set up Tito for the big running splash, Tito manages to roll out of the way. And then Tito starts going after Bundy's leg to try to set him up for that signature bridging leg pin. But again, Bundy powers out of it. And that kind of intensifies things because, Bundy starts getting more aggressive with the offense. And it ends up with Tito firing off Bundy during a little comeback sequence. He tries to do the running charge at Bundy toward the ropes. But Bundy, out of desperation, intentionally backdrops Tito out to the floor. As we all know, that constitutes an automatic disqualification in most territories. So Tito actually wins via technicality. But Bundy ends up getting the last laugh because he goes out to the floor and pow drives Tito on the concrete. And of course, Boyd's telling the story that Bundy's not really interested in winning matches. He's just trying to hurt people. So in Bundy's mind, that's a win for him. But yeah, this is really good. And I don't remember them announcing this the previous week. When the graphic came up for this match, I just kind of figured it was going to be a typical Bundy enhancement match. Maybe Tito would give him a little bit of a fight, but I did not expect it to be this competitive. So it wound up being a pleasant surprise. Really enjoyed this. The injury angle afterwards gives me the impression they may have done this to write Tito out of the company. Because he's about to go to the WWF pretty soon, right? Can't remember if that's 83 or 84 when he signs with them. So if this was Tito's swan song, then holy shit. What a way to leave the area. Not only does he not have to do the job on the way out the door, he basically beat Bundy in the process. By DQ, yes. But a win's a win, right? I mean, that's almost unheard of. So this truly was Tito's actual send-off. What a way to go out. In a blaze of glory. So now we come to the point in the show where they recap the Butch Reed JYD confrontation. And again, just to set the scene in case you missed it. Reed is sick of being held back in Mid-South, wrestling all these ham and eggers every week. He's been patiently waiting his turn in line for a shot at the North American title, and he's done with friendships and waiting in line. From now on, Butch Reed is only looking out for himself. And I will note a couple things during this brawl with Dog and Reed, and eventually when DiBiase came in. I kind of thought about it the other week, but didn't really want to draw too much attention to it. Seeing it on replay, though, it just really pissed me off. Dog refusing to register and sell Reed's punches. God, that shit was annoying. It just made Reed's offense look so sloppy. Because you can tell he's clearly not trying to lay into anything. But Dog's giving him nothing to work with. He's not even bothering to sell the punches. And it's not until Ted finally comes out and clocks Dog in the back of the head with his cast It's when Dog finally sells it like he's dead. And the other thing, too, probably the bigger story to come out of all of it, the fans chanting for Duggan to run out and help the Dog. But he never shows up. And again, those two are not necessarily friends. They were tag partners. But there's a lot of bad blood that goes back to their previous history. But even Boyd and Bill didn't really draw too much attention to it here. It was very strange. But of course, they have to let us know how courageous and great the Dog is. So they pieced together this little highlight package to show Dog beating ass in Mid-South, taking out all the top heels. Damage control. But they basically left us with the message: Dog is mentally distraught over what happened. But along with that comes frustration and anger. And Hacksaw Reed's going to have to answer to that in due time. Translation, he done fucked up. It was all a fine setup for the Butch Reed-Tim Horner match. Our very first look at heel Hacksaw Reed in Mid-South. And in addition to the personality change, so changes the physicality. Reed's immediately more aggressive here, trash-talking Horner throughout the entire match, which I always loved. Hacksaw Butch Reed talking smack on his opponents. It was like the best thing in the world. This was probably the only time in recorded history where I would actually have sympathy for Tim Horner getting his ass kicked. Because this poor fucker was beaten savagely. Reed's just powerlifting this guy from bell to bell. I think I counted in total 4 overhead press slams before he finally put him away with a knee on the chest. Call it a mercy pin. Like, even during the moments where Horner was trying to fire up, he was very quickly shut down. It was all about getting Butch Reed over as a monster heel. Trying to attract eyeballs to this new ring style. And it was awesome. You know, the Irish McNeil fans just kind of sat in silence the whole time. A couple of them chanted, "Go home, Reed." But for the most part, they just looked on in complete bewilderment. Like, fuck, dude. This JYD's got his hands full. For the first time in Mid-South, you probably had fans that were legitimately thinking, maybe this guy's a bit too much for Dog to handle. How's he going to be able to overcome this powerhouse? He may have found his equal. So this was perfect. And then we followed with Mr. Olympia and Boris Zerkov versus Art Cruz and George Weingroff. Our first look at George Weingroff in Mid-South. But it is not our first time reviewing a George Weingroff match. We've seen a little bit of his work going back to Dallas from some of those older tapes in 84. I think it was 84. And we all kind of know his backstory. He was basically legally blind in one eye, so his work style was a little unorthodox at times. My running joke throughout this match, the one-eyed George Weingroff is still 1,000 times better than a two-eyed, able-bodied Boris Zerkov. God, that guy was the shits. I mean, it was a showcase squash for the Rat Pack. They set up the spot at the end where Zerkov gave Cruz a really sloppy-looking neckbreaker. Because did I mention he fucking sucks? And as he goes up to the middle rope to hit his knee drop, Weingroff cuts him off. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ring, Olympia's setting up his gimmick on his boot. So when Cruz goes to lift Zerkov for a body slam, Olympia runs over and drop kicks Cruz in the back. And then Zerkov goes over to cover him for the pinfall. Little jumbled and chaotic at the end there. But they're still putting over Olympia's signature gimmick. Somehow nobody's called this into question yet. despite having visual evidence of this gimmick on television for like 2 months now. Apparently nobody's been watching their tapes. I'm half kidding. Everything about this was fine. Except Boris Zurkov. That'll be the new running gag for all the Midsouth programs. Until he leaves. The show was fine. Except Boris Zurkov. Then we had Magnum TA versus Rip Rogers. Buddy Nichols was back on commentary for this one. His first comments in this match were him completely forgetting Magnum's full name. He got the Magnum part right. But you could tell he plainly wanted to say P.I. So he had to stop and think about it for a minute. All in all, there wasn't much to say. Magnum won with the atomic drop in like 90 seconds. It was a match that happened on the program. Nothing to really write home about. And our final thing on the program this week was them giving a bit of an inside scoop on Mil Mascaras. And Boyd set up that he would be in Mid-South next week. But before he debuts, they wanted to share a little bit of Houston footage to introduce the fans. Just to let everybody know what his ring style is like. So we pitched to the footage. He's wrestling the Black Ninja. Paul Bosch was calling the action here. God bless his soul. I'm telling you, man, Paul's commentary made Buddy Nichols sound like fucking Jim Ross. But what they showed here was cool. I mean, in Houston, Mil Mascaras was over like wildfire. He was definitely more of a high spot athlete. Which makes sense given the lucha background. I have no idea how the fuck he got anything watchable out of Kendo Nagasaki of all people. But it was perfectly fine. He went over with a flying crossbody. I don't think they said who he'd be facing next week. It was just kind of one of those general he'll be in the area messages. So we didn't get much context. But I always like it when they do stuff like this, where they actually take the time to show footage of incoming talent from other regions in the country. Let the audience know that he's important and we should keep our eyes peeled. But, yeah, overall, pretty enjoyable show. The Bundy-Tito match was a lot of fun. But again, coming off the heels of last week, you know, everybody was fixated on Hacksaw Butch Reed. It almost made everything else in the show seem inferior by comparison, just because Butch was so topical. But now they've got their next hot program with him and Dog. They'll be at the forefront. It was also cool seeing two back in the mix. Duggan was nowhere to be seen this week. But you know, it's one of those things where they had so much star power around this time. Whenever you see some of the bigger names missing, you know, it doesn't really hit you until you recap the show and you realize, oh yeah, so-and-so wasn't on the show this week. You know, it's like what I mentioned with Wrestling 2. I really hadn't thought about it much until I was doing something throughout the week and it was a thought that just kind of sprang to mind. I'm like, yeah, we haven't seen Wrestling 2 in a hot minute. And funny enough, he shows up on the very next episode. But yeah, I'm just... what else to say? The shows are a lot of fun. I genuinely look forward to watching these programs every single week. All these Mid-South historical retro review series shows. They're not boring. They're well worth the investment. And we're not even approaching the real climax period. 84 is when business really kicks up. You know what business isn't kicking up? Yeah, world class. It's certainly stagnated. I saw the graphic monologue for the week for the advertisement of the return of Killer Tim Brooks. And at first I thought it was a rib. I was like, Killer Tim Brooks? Really now? That's their solution? That's what's going to turn around business? I'm half kidding. I've got nothing against Tim Brooks. I have no clue what Bill Mercer meant when he said, returning to Dallas. We've been reviewing World Class since the mid to late portion of 1982. I promise you, there's never been one sighting of Killer Tim Brooks in World Class Championship Wrestling since we started these reviews. Maybe he was just referring to Texas. We'll get to Killer Tim Brooks in just a bit. He was sort of the unintentional highlight of the entire episode, if you could believe that. First, we got to talk about Rip Oliver versus Bobby Fulton. The epitome of who do we have on standby that we can just throw out there and have a match? Bobby Fulton and Rip Oliver it is. And this was, in fact, the absolute definition of just a match. There was nothing wrong with it. They just did some moves for a while. Bobby had his ribs taped up so Rip could try to get some heat by working those. Although I can't even really argue he did a good job at that, because he was only really sporadically working the ribs. The crowd was having more fun calling Jim Cornette a wimp the whole time. But they're going back and forth to the finish. You eventually have Bobby backing Rip up into the corner so you can start doing the 10 punches on the turnbuckle pad. And I'm honestly not even sure what the deal was at the finish. I think JC gave Rip some leverage so that Bobby would crash and burn on the mat. Either that or he just picked Bobby's foot. Couldn't really tell on the replay. And then Rip just sort of walked over, punched him in the gut with something resembling a karate chop. And then he pinned him. It was, again, not a bad match. Just kind of long and not all that interesting. You know, it kind of describes the run to the Midnights and the Fantastics in Dallas. Minus the long part. But it was definitely uninteresting. It's so bizarre seeing them focusing so much on Cornette managing Rip Oliver around this point, as opposed to Dennis and Bobby. Like, we see those two on occasion, but 50% of the time, they're either just bodies outside the ring, or they'll maybe run in to do angles after a match, where they end up getting thwarted or run off in the end. It really does make me wonder, was there ever actually a plan when they brought the Midnights in? Aside from feuding them with the Fantastics and then just making them flunkies afterwards? Because I really have not been all that impressed. I remember the run was uneventful. I apparently forgot just how dreary it was. Thankfully, the next segment made up for that in spades. Okay, no cap. This may have been the wackiest thing I've ever seen on world-class television yet. And that is truly saying a lot. We got some insight on why Killer Tim Brooks was brought back to Dallas. I should have figured. Gary Hart was going to be at the helm. This was so remarkable. It was like perfect train wreck television that you could only do in one take. And I'm so glad they kept the original, because they would never have been able to replicate this if they tried. It begins with Gary Hart trying to give Brooks the big introduction. And of course, what happens right at the very beginning of the tape? Some mark in a fucking pickup truck just rides right into the shot, tries to chat up Gary Hart mid-promo. And of course, Hart has to break character momentarily and tell the fan, I'm busy shooting. Not right now. I can't talk. I'm sorry. We'll come back to the truck driver in a sec. He made a second special cameo here. So eventually you see a motorcycle come in. And this turns out to be Killer Tim Brooks. And I mean, I tried my best to figure out what the hell was happening here. I was still very confused when it was over. I believe the story is Brooks and the one-man gang were former partners or friends in some of the northern regions of the country or whatever. And, well, since Gang is affiliated with Gary Hart, he knew that Brooks would be a good addition to his crew, although they were still looking to try to recruit a third man. No, it will not be Hulk Hogan. And, there was something here about Brooks mentioning that he broke Mike Von Erich's shoulder in some venue at some random location in the country. I have no fucking clue. And the part that makes this amazing, as they're explaining this story, and as Brooks is going insane trying to explain what he did to Mike, he gets off of his motorcycle, whips this giant biker chain into a mud puddle next to him, begins playing in the mud, not making that up. He's wiping the shit all over his face. There's no way any of this was pre-planned in the slightest. I refuse to believe it. Even Gary's like, get out of the mud, you idiot. The fuck is wrong with you? And of course, way off in the distance, remember that pickup truck I was telling you about? The fan that decided to photobomb the set? That very same truck, it is parked off in the background, on the side of the road, facing the set. This guy got a front row seat to the best wrestling pre-tape of all time, and he didn't even know it. So, well, here's what also makes the whole thing glorious. Again, I tell you they did this all in one take. After Gary kind of wrapped up everything and said that he's planning to assemble a three-man heel stable or whatever the deal is, behind them, it's a giant billboard promoting the McDonald's McDLT. Just plastered front and center right behind them. Like they were doing a real-life commercial. I'm telling you, there's no fucking way they did multiple takes on this. Can only imagine what was going through everybody's mind when they were post-producing it. They were probably laughing their asses off. Gary Hart was probably solely responsible for making sure they didn't do it a second time. He said, no, we're keeping this. This is gold. It was so beyond wacky. But it was perfect. There's crazy old Tim Brooks with mud splotches all over his face, looking out of his goddamn mind. So then we go back to the Sportatorium for more wrestling. It's Bobby Eaton versus Scott Casey. Speaking of beautiful Bobby working random sporadic matches, you know, at least this is somewhat tied into what Cornette is doing with Scott Casey and their feud over this fucking green suit jacket. It was less hideous than Bobby's Pepto-Bismol colored ring pants. That was probably the only time in history I recall Bobby wearing all pink anything. Glad it was a rarity. I mean, Bobby certainly tried here, but I cannot in good faith say that Scott Casey adapted well to the Bobby Eaton ring style. This was a spot that happened a little past the halfway point. There was like a 2-minute sequence where Bobby's just laying on top of Scott, trying to wrestle his shoulders down. At the same time, you can audibly hear him calling spots. Almost like Casey was totally clueless as to what they were supposed to do next. So Ian's just kind of laying there and trying to call everything up to, including the finishes, to make sure nothing gets fucked up. There was an angle that did kind of make me laugh. Earlier on, Bobby Eaton actually grabbed a hold of the green jacket, but they do the classic cartoon trip spot where Casey goes down on all fours so that Bobby would kind of stumble over him and then take the goofy bump onto his back. And of course, the jacket goes flying out of his hands, so Casey can toss it to Sunshine at ringside. It is legitimately a tale of the Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner at this point. With this fucking jacket, dude. Every time the heels gain possession of it, somehow they're immediately thwarted, and they lose it again. But the deal at the end is JC using a racket on Casey while Bobby had him tied in the ropes. But Rick Hazard's view was obstructed. So Bobby Fulton, who was already down at ringside, comes over and pops Cornette in the mouth. And while Eaton's leaning through the ropes to yell at him, Casey sneaks in the back door and schoolboys Eaton for the 3 count. Another instance where the Midnights are just there to do jobs. It's another singles match, using Bobby as enhancement fodder to get over the bigger story. And still, because it's Bobby, he looks way too goddamn hard and bumps his ass off for such little return. I still maintain this is the dumbest storyline Cornette's ever been involved with. I know this all predates our recaps of the Jim Herd era in WCW. Maybe I'll change my mind when we dive a little deeper down that rabbit hole. But so far, in all of our recaps of the Midnight Express timeline, this feud with JC and Scott Casey over this green suit jacket, it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen him involved with. But that led us to the main event. It is Brian Adias versus Killer Tim Brooks. And yes, Mr. Brooks did take the time to wash his face before showing up to the Sportatorium. Would have been 1,000 times better if he actually showed up with dry mud all over his forehead. The whole idea here is to kind of spotlight Brooks and reacquaint him with the Texas fans. You know, they already saw him rolling around in the dirt earlier. So you can only imagine what this match was going to be like once the bell rang. They did not completely undercut Adias, though. They actually gave him a little bit of offense over Brooks here. But, you know, once Brooks started going after and dissecting the leg, I mean, he pretty much had the match in the bag. Just kept targeting Adias until Bronco had to stop the match and awarded to Brooks via forfeit. And, well, Mark Lorenz actually fucked it up at first. Initially, he said that Brooks was disqualified. But then he had to quickly correct himself, and he said, match was stopped. Never mind. Brooks is the winner. Of course, afterwards, he tries to go after the leg to further injure Adias, drumming up a bit of sympathy on him. It was definitely a good time to get over a heavy heat angle. You know, Adias is somebody that you can beat, and it's not really going to hurt his status in the company. I didn't really have any issues with it. It was more of a heat angle than it was an actual wrestling match, but it's fine. You know, considering what they gave us this week, it was actually a good choice to go out on. Without Brooks on this one, they would have put me to sleep. God almighty. It was just a nothing happening episode. I continue to be amazed at how little they're actually getting out of the Midnights at this point. It's almost on par with what Tony Khan doing with FTR. just wasting them in meaningless programs and treating them like just another set of dudes on the roster. Or in the case of when they do get spotlighted, they always fucking lose. No wonder nobody gives a shit anymore. That's exactly what they're doing with Bobby and Dennis here in World Class. Just beating them like a drum over and over again. At least here, though, you already knew they had one foot out the door. So you can kind of justify the shitty booking. And it's another week, too, where the Von Erichs are just completely left off the show. Their names are mentioned. But it's just so weird not seeing them in any physical capacity. There's a lot of weird things happening in World Class around this point. Struggling for survival. That's the tale of the tape. But we keep rolling along in the series here on the FSWR channel. As always, thanks everybody for tuning in for this episode. And I'm not even going to say anything for Monday. I'm not going to make any promises about any segments we're reviewing. Watch the show. Wait and see. We do have King of the Ring to review. And we'll probably tie in the following Raw afterwards. So, yeah, it'll probably be another 3-segment show. 95 King of the Ring, Retro Raw, and Retro NXT. So, stay posted for all that. And we'll catch you guys soon. Take care. Peace out.